What if I told you that there's a single sentence, just one sentence, that could completely transform your financial reality, and it was hidden in plain sight by one of the most influential prosperity teachers of all time? But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. Now, I know what you're thinking. You've probably heard countless promises about manifestation techniques, abundance affirmations, and visualization methods that claim to bring wealth into your life. Has this ever happened to you? You've tried scripting your desires, repeated countless affirmations, visualized your dream bank account until your head hurt. Yet somehow the breakthrough you're seeking remains just out of reach. Here's what most people don't know. Florence Scovel Shinn, the legendary author who transformed millions of lives with her teachings on prosperity consciousness, carried a secret throughout her entire career, a technique so profound, so direct in its simplicity, that she only revealed it in her final teachings. Her most devoted students were left wondering why she had waited until the very end to share something this powerful. What you're about to discover might surprise you, because this isn't another manifestation method to add to your collection. This isn't about scripting your ideal life in a journal, creating vision boards, or repeating affirmations until you convince yourself they're true. Stay with me until the end, because what Florence discovered goes far deeper than anything she had taught before. She realized that we've been approaching abundance completely backwards. While everyone else was focused on doing techniques, she uncovered something that isn't about doing at all. It's about a fundamental shift in understanding that changes everything. Think about this for a moment. What if the reason your financial desires haven't manifested isn't because you're not trying hard enough, but because you've been operating from a place that actually contradicts what you're seeking? What if every time you say, "I want to be wealthy," or "I hope money comes to me," you're unknowingly pushing abundance away from yourself? Florence Scovel Shinn discovered that there's a specific way of speaking, a particular sentence structure that doesn't just request abundance. It commands it. Not through force, not through desperation, but through aligning with a truth so fundamental that the universe has no choice but to respond. This single sentence doesn't beg the universe for money. It doesn't hope for financial freedom. Instead, it operates from a place of such profound understanding about the nature of reality that it literally reshapes your entire financial destiny from the inside out. The method she revealed was so direct, so pure in its approach, that it left even her closest followers stunned. Because once you understand this principle, once it truly clicks in your consciousness, everything changes. Your entire life begins to bend in response to this new understanding, and what seemed impossible before becomes not just possible, but inevitable. If you're ready for this deeper level of truth about consciousness and abundance, I'd love to have you subscribe. This is where we go beyond surface techniques and discover what actually creates lasting transformation. But here's where it gets really interesting. In one of her final teachings, Florence Scovel Shinn said something that completely shattered everything her students thought they knew about prosperity, prayer, and the very nature of reality itself. She titled this revolutionary revelation, "God and I are one." And when she spoke these words, there was something different in her voice. Gone were the gentle metaphors and poetic symbolism that had characterized her earlier work. This was raw, unfiltered truth. She declared that the I Am within you is literally God, not a representation of God, not a connection to God, but God itself dwelling within your very being. This wasn't spiritual poetry or inspirational language designed to make people feel better about themselves. Florence was revealing the hidden truth that transforms everything about how manifestation actually works. Most people completely miss this crucial understanding, and it's precisely why their financial manifestations fail time after time. They approach abundance from a place of separation, believing they need to convince some external force to grant their wishes. The transformation happens when you grasp this mind-bending reality. When you speak, when you declare your financial desires, you're not just sending words into the cosmos, hoping something magical will happen. You're speaking from the very name of creation itself. Every time you say, "I am," you're invoking the same creative force that brought galaxies into existence, that formed stars and planets, that breathes life into every living thing. This is the hidden truth behind why some people seem to effortlessly attract wealth, while others struggle despite doing all the right techniques. Those who naturally prosper understand, either consciously or unconsciously, that their words carry the authority of creation. They don't beg for abundance because they recognize they are the source of abundance. They don't hope for financial security because they speak from a place where security already exists. When Florence revealed this secret, she was essentially handing her students the master key to reality itself. The moment you truly comprehend that the "I am" consciousness within you is the same force that creates worlds, everything shifts. This revelation completely changes how you approach your relationship with money. Write in the comments, "I am ready for this truth," if this revelation is beginning to shift something inside you. Those two words, "I am," are far more powerful than most people ever realize. Every single time you place words after "I am," you're not just making casual conversation or describing your current circumstances. You're wielding the creative force of the universe itself. When you say, "I am broke," you think you're simply stating a fact about your bank account. But what you're actually doing is using the name of God to anchor that exact condition into your reality. This is where most people unknowingly sabotage their own financial transformation. They spend their days unconsciously programming limitation into their lives through careless speech. "I am struggling. I am always behind on bills. I am not good with money." Each of these statements carries the full creative authority of the divine consciousness within you. The universe doesn't argue with your declarations. It simply responds to who you declare yourself to be. The hidden truth that Florence discovered is that the world around you is constantly responding to your identity, not your hopes or wishes. You can hope for financial abundance all you want, but if your core identity remains, "I am someone who struggles with money," then struggle is exactly what you'll continue to experience. Your external circumstances are simply a mirror reflecting back the identity you've been unconsciously claiming. This revelation creates a profound shift in how you approach your entire financial journey. Instead of trying to manifest from a place of lack, you begin to understand that transformation happens through a fundamental decision about who you are. Right now, I want you to experience something powerful. Take a slow, deep breath and say these words out loud. "I am financially secure." Don't rush through it. Let each word land in your consciousness. Feel how different this is from saying, "I want to be financially secure," or "I hope to become wealthy someday." Those statements place your desired reality somewhere in the future, always just out of reach. But when you declare, "I am financially secure," something completely different happens. You're not trying to convince the world of anything. You're remembering a truth that has always existed within you, waiting patiently for you to claim it. This isn't about faking it until you make it, or pretending something that isn't true. This is about recognizing and embodying the financial security that exists at the level of your true identity before it has even manifested in your physical experience. If this message resonated deep within you, a like helps ensure others who are ready for this understanding will find their way here, too. The impact of this simple shift in language is profound. because it aligns your conscious declarations with the creative power that flows through you. When your words match the divine authority within you, the universe has no choice but to reorganize itself around your new self concept. Right, I declare it. In the comments if you can feel the difference between hoping for abundance and being abundance. What happens when you speak those words? I am financially secure goes far beyond simple positive thinking. You're actually participating in a sacred act of creation. Each time you declare this truth, you're aligning your conscious awareness with a deeper reality that already exists within the quantum field of infinite possibility. This process of alignment is like carving truth into the very fabric of reality itself. When you speak from the name of God within you, when you use the creative authority of I am, with full awareness of its power, you're issuing a divine decree that begins to reorganize the energy patterns around your life. The journey of transformation becomes less about trying to change your external circumstances and more about remembering and embodying the truth of who you are at the deepest level. Every declaration becomes an act of remembrance rather than an attempt to create something new. Financial security isn't something you need to acquire from outside yourself. It's something you recognize as already being part of your essential nature. But there's an even more profound layer to this revelation that Florence discovered. She found that there's tremendous power in returning to the pure essence of those two words, without any additions or qualifications whatsoever. I want you to experience this right now. Find a quiet space around you. Turn off any background music, step away from distractions, and simply sit in complete stillness. In this sacred silence, say just two words. Not, I am wealthy. Not, I am successful. Not even, I am financially secure. Just, I am. Let these words ring through your consciousness like a bell echoing in an empty cathedral. In that moment of pure being, something extraordinary happens. You're not reaching for anything external. You're not trying to become something you're not already. Instead, you're remembering the essential truth of your existence. You're touching the source from which all abundance flows. This simple practice connects you directly to the same creative force that brings galaxies into existence, that orchestrates the perfect timing of seasons. When you rest in pure, I am, consciousness, you're not separate from this force. You are this force expressing itself through your unique perspective and experience. Right? I remember. In the comments if you can feel the difference between trying to become something and simply being what you already are. This practice of sacred stillness is where the real magic begins to unfold. When you deliberately create space for this divine connection, you're creating the perfect environment for profound transformation to take root in your life. Let me guide you through this experience right now. Wherever you are, find a way to minimize distractions around you. Put your phone aside, turn off any background noise, and give yourself permission to simply be present. Sit comfortably and allow your shoulders to naturally drop and relax. Feel the tension leaving your body as you take a slow, deep breath in through your nose. And then exhale even more slowly through your mouth. Now in this space of growing stillness, speak those two words again. I am. But this time let them settle into your body, like the resonance of a bell in a silent cathedral. Don't rush to the next thought or the next distraction. Simply allow these words to reverberate through your entire being. What you're experiencing in this moment, that profound sense of quiet awareness, that deep stillness that seems to expand beyond the boundaries of your physical body. This isn't emptiness. What you're touching is the very essence of divine consciousness itself. Florence Scovel Shinn recognized this sacred space as the foundation of all creation, the source point from which every manifestation in the physical world originates. Right now, you're not just practicing a technique, you're stepping directly into the source from which all abundance flows. There's something special about people who are ready to move beyond typical manifestation advice and embrace these profound truths. If that's you, hit subscribe and join this journey of awakening. This realization completely transforms your relationship with manifestation and abundance. When you recognize that this stillness, this quiet awareness within you, is actually God expressing through your individual consciousness, everything changes. You stop looking outside yourself for validation, for permission, for someone or something else to grant you the financial security you desire. The journey becomes an inner one, a process of returning again and again to this place of deep knowing. Drop, "I feel it," in the comments if you can sense this deeper awareness beginning to awaken within you. The challenge most people face is maintaining this profound connection. Once they step back into their daily routines, life has a way of pulling you back into old patterns that contradict everything you've just experienced in that sacred stillness. This is precisely why Florence emphasized the critical importance of remembering. Not just remembering the technique or the words, but remembering the truth of who you are at the deepest level. The world around you will constantly try to convince you otherwise. Friends and family might inadvertently reinforce old limiting beliefs about money. Society will bombard you with messages about scarcity and struggle. Your own mind will attempt to pull you back into familiar patterns of lack and limitation. This is why you need constant reminders of this truth. The transformation becomes permanent when you begin to understand the sacred responsibility that comes with this knowledge. Once you truly realize that "I am" is literally the name of God expressing through your consciousness, everything about how you communicate changes at a fundamental level. You can no longer speak carelessly after those two words. You can no longer casually attach fear, worry, lack, or limitation to that holy name. Right? I choose my words carefully. In the comments if you're beginning to understand the sacred power of conscious speech. This protective method against unconscious self-sabotage begins with a fundamental shift in how you use language, particularly around the word want. This word might seem harmless, even positive, but it carries within it a vibration that actually pushes abundance away from you every time you use it. When you say, "I want to be financially free," you think you're expressing a positive desire. But what you're actually doing is confirming to the universe that you don't currently have financial freedom. The very act of wanting something places it permanently in the future, always just out of reach. Consider this profound truth: God doesn't want anything. Divine consciousness doesn't hope for things to improve or wish for better circumstances. The creative force of the universe operates through declaration, through the absolute certainty of ease, rather than the uncertainty of might be. When you align your speech with this divine pattern, when you say, "I am financially secure," instead of, "I want to be financially secure," you're speaking the same language that creates worlds. When content creates that aha moment of remembering who you really are, your like helps share this message with other souls ready for this truth. The same principle applies to hope. While hope might feel more positive than despair, it still operates from the assumption that your good exists somewhere in the future. When you say, "I hope wealth finds me," you're inadvertently placing yourself in a passive position, waiting for something external to discover you. But when you understand that you are wealth itself, when you recognize that abundance is not something you acquire, but something you embody, everything changes. You stop looking for wealth to find you and start expressing the wealth that already exists within your divine nature. You say, "I am wealth," because this isn't about convincing yourself of something that isn't true. It's about recognizing a truth that transcends physical appearances. In the realm of spirit, there is no time, no delay, no waiting period between intention and reality. There is only the eternal now, the present moment where all possibilities exist simultaneously. When you speak from this timeless awareness, when your identity statements come from this place of immediate presence, you're operating from the same consciousness that creates instant manifestation. Right? I am abundant now. In the comments, if you can feel the energetic difference between wanting abundance and being abundance. When you declare, I am financially secure, you're not trying to convince the universe of something that isn't true. You're recognizing and declaring something that already exists at the level of spirit, in the realm where all possibilities are simultaneously present and available. The truth of your financial security, your abundance, your prosperity, these aren't things you need to create or manufacture. They already exist as potentials within the infinite field of consciousness. Your role isn't to make them happen, but to anchor these spiritual realities into physical expression through the power of conscious recognition and declaration. This understanding transforms your entire approach from one of struggle and effort to one of alignment and allowing. The three-dimensional world around you, your bank account, your bills, your financial circumstances. These are not permanent fixtures of reality. They are fluid expressions of consciousness that must rearrange themselves to match the truth you consistently embody and declare. When you maintain the inner knowing of your financial security, when you speak from that place of divine certainty, the outer world has no choice but to conform to your inner reality. Think about what actually happened during that moment of sacred stillness when you whispered, I am, and attached only truth to those words. You weren't speaking empty affirmations. You were speaking the word itself, the same creative force that spoke light into existence, that formed galaxies and stars. This recognition changes everything about how you move through your daily life. You're no longer someone trying to create abundance from the outside. You're someone who has remembered that you are the very source from which abundance flows. Right? Spoke through me. In the comments, if you can feel the profound shift from trying to create to recognizing that you are creation itself. Florence shared a profound teaching about the very purpose of human existence. She revealed that God became man so that man may become God, not in an egotistical sense, but as a return to the divine consciousness that was always your true nature. When you understand this truth, everything about how you move through the world transforms. You don't walk around with arrogance or forced positivity. Instead, you carry a quiet inner knowing, a calm certainty that whispers, I no longer hope for it. I've already claimed it. This shift in how you navigate your daily life is subtle but profound. When you walk into a room, you're not seeking approval or permission to feel abundant. When you interact with money, whether paying bills or receiving income, you do so from a place of inner authority, rather than anxiety or desperation. Florence defined faith as loyalty to the unseen reality. It's not blind belief or wishful thinking, but rather unwavering commitment to a truth that exists beyond what your physical senses can currently perceive. This kind of faith doesn't waver when the bank statement arrives, or when unexpected expenses appear, because it's anchored in something deeper than external circumstances. Right? I embody what I seek. In the comments, if you can feel the difference between performing abundance and authentically being abundance. The real test of this transformation comes precisely in those moments when doubt creeps in, when your old programming tries to reassert itself, when bills arrive that seem to contradict your new identity. These moments are not failures or signs that the process isn't working. They're opportunities to demonstrate the depth of your new understanding. When doubt whispers its familiar songs of limitation, your response becomes completely different from how you used to handle these challenges. You don't panic or abandon your new identity. Instead, you simply return. You return back to I am. You return back to the version of yourself who already knows, who already embodies financial security at the deepest level. This isn't about fighting the doubt. It's about gently redirecting your attention back to the truth that remains constant, regardless of temporary mental fluctuations. Your new state of financial security becomes absolutely real the moment you assume it, not the moment it appears in your bank account. This understanding completely changes how you interpret what you see around you. During the transition period, you might not see dramatic changes in your financial situation immediately. But what you're witnessing isn't the truth of your new reality. It's simply residue, the echo of your old state, still playing itself out in your external circumstances. Your old financial identity is still echoing through your current experience, but the new sound has already been spoken. The journey becomes one of patient loyalty to your new identity, while allowing the old echoes to gradually fade away naturally. Write, "I trust the process" in the comments if you understand that your transformation is real, even before the external evidence appears. When small incidents begin to occur, perhaps an unexpected refund appears, someone mentions an opportunity, or you have an inspired idea about increasing your financial flow. The tendency is to respond with surprise and uncertainty. But this tentative questioning response actually undermines the very foundation of what you've established. When you say, "Maybe it's working," you're placing yourself back in the position of testing the law, rather than living it. The transformation in your response is profound. When these incidents occur, instead of tentative hope, you respond with calm certainty. "Of course, it's working." This isn't arrogance. It's the natural response of someone who understands that they are no longer experimenting with manifestation, but are now embodying a new reality. Write, "Of course it's working" in the comments if you can feel yourself shifting from testing your new reality to simply living it. You discover a place of such deep knowing that the very need to work at manifestation begins to dissolve. After you've spoken the words with divine authority, after you've received these revelations about your true identity, something extraordinary happens. You go quiet again. But this silence is completely different from uncertainty. This is the quiet confidence of someone who finally knows. You've remembered the most liberating truth of all. You don't have to chase your desires, or convince the universe to grant them to you. You only need to assume their reality at the level of identity and consciousness. That new sense of identity, as someone who is financially secure, that inner knowing that transcends your current bank balance. This is all that was ever missing from your life. Not more techniques, not better strategies, but simply the remembrance of who you are. From this place of quiet knowing comes permission to let the world catch up to your new reality, while you remain unshakably loyal to the truth you've discovered. Florence's definition of faith becomes your guiding principle. Faith is loyalty to the unseen reality. True faith doesn't demand proof from the external world before it believes. Instead, it simply walks steady and calm, carrying the inner certainty that what has been declared in consciousness must eventually manifest in form. Write, "I am loyal to my truth" in the comments if you can feel this quiet confidence beginning to replace the old need to constantly work at manifestation. You discover that you don't need signs anymore. The desperate searching for evidence, the constant checking of your bank account balance, all of this falls away naturally. This isn't because you've become complacent. It's because you've moved beyond the need for external validation of what you already know to be true at the deepest level. You've already spoken the word. You've already declared your identity. And when the word is spoken from genuine identity, rather than desperate hope, Florence taught that it becomes flesh. It takes form in the physical world. You literally don't live in the old way anymore. You've moved not just mentally or emotionally, but at the level of your very being. You've stepped into something larger, quieter, more solid than the small, fearful identity that used to worry about money. Right? I have moved. In the comments if you can feel yourself stepping into this larger, quieter, more solid version of who you are. You begin to understand that you are the cause, and the world around you is the effect. This isn't some abstract concept. This is the actual mechanics of how reality operates. Everything you desire, including large sums of money, financial overflow, and the freedom that comes with true security, is already being drawn toward you like iron filings to a magnet. Not because you're trying to attract these things through effort, but because they are naturally drawn to the truth of who you've chosen to be. When you embody the consciousness of financial security, the universe begins to organize itself around that truth. Opportunities align, people appear, circumstances shift, money flows, all in perfect harmony with the inner reality you've established. Your real power begins when this elevated state stops feeling like a miracle and starts feeling like your new normal. When "I am financially secure" is no longer something special that you whisper during meditation, but something you carry unconsciously into every moment of your day. You reach a point where abundance consciousness becomes as natural as breathing. It becomes the background music of your existence, the default setting of your consciousness. Right. This is my normal now. In the comments if you can feel this transformation settling into something natural and effortless within you. Real wealth doesn't feel like excitement or high vibration energy. Real wealth feels like the complete absence of grasping. The absence of needing money to show up today. The absence of watching your life like a scoreboard. When you reach this natural state, you discover that true prosperity consciousness is remarkably calm, quiet, and ordinary. There's no desperation in it, no urgency, no sense that you need to maintain some special feeling or energy. It simply is, the way breathing simply is. The way your heartbeat simply continues, without your conscious effort. This feeling becomes so natural that you might not even recognize it as wealth consciousness at first. Instead, it manifests as an unshakable inner, knowing that everything is always working out, that your needs are always met. That security is your natural state, rather than something you have to achieve. When this feeling becomes genuinely natural, something extraordinary happens in your external world. The world begins to follow your lead through resonance and law. Not through your efforts to make it happen, but through the automatic response of reality to your transformed inner state. Florence taught, change your conception of yourself, and you will automatically change the world in which you live. The word, automatically, is crucial here. You don't have to figure out how to change your external circumstances. Instead, you shift at the level of identity and consciousness, and the world catches up to match your new inner reality. Your outer world is always a perfect reflection of your inner world. Right? I feel the shift. In the comments if you can sense this natural automatic process beginning to work in your own life. When something does arrive in your life, whether it's an unexpected refund, a new client, an investment opportunity, or money flowing from sources you never anticipated, your response becomes radically different. You don't gasp in disbelief or feel shocked. Instead, you respond with calm recognition. You say, either aloud or in the quiet certainty of your heart, of course, this is who I am now. There's no drama in it. No overwhelming excitement that suggests you didn't expect it. There's simply the peaceful acknowledgement of natural law working perfectly. This shift from surprise to recognition marks one of the most significant milestones in your entire transformation journey. You're no longer affirming or trying to convince yourself. You're simply remembering. But here's something crucial about maintaining this elevated state. Don't try to hold on to this feeling or tense up around it. Instead, relax completely and let this truth settle into your bones like warmth from a fire on a cold day. You don't need to stay high vibe all day long. constantly monitoring your emotional state. You just need to stay loyal to the new version of yourself. Right. I am relaxing into my truth. In the comments, if you can feel yourself letting go of the need to force this state and simply allowing it to be natural. When you reach this place of natural ease with your new identity, you arrive at what can only be described as the end of seeking itself. This is the end of waiting for your life to begin. This is the end of trying to make things happen through force or desperate manifestation techniques. From now on, you are no longer becoming financially secure. You are being financially secure. You are no longer seeking abundance. You are remembering the abundance that has always been your true nature. This remembrance will accomplish more in your life than 1,000 vision boards, more than years of affirmations, more than countless manifestation courses ever could. Because remembrance operates from truth, while seeking operates from the illusion that you lack something essential. Take a moment right now to seal this new reality into your consciousness. Say it again. I am financially secure. Let it ring within you without effort. Let it echo through your entire being without fear or doubt. Allow these words to live in you, not as a phrase you've memorized, but as a presence that has taken up residence in the core of your being. Feel the truth of it settling into every cell of your body, every corner of your consciousness. This isn't about convincing yourself of something that isn't true. This is about recognizing something that has always been true. You're not waiting anymore for this to become real. You've already arrived at the truth of who you are. Right, I have arrived. In the comments, if you can feel this shift from seeking to being, from becoming to already having arrived at your true abundant nature. When your inner state remains genuinely unshaken by external circumstances, the outer world has no choice but to eventually conform to your unwavering inner reality. The magnetism you develop through this consistency is unlike anything you've experienced before. Opportunities begin to find you rather than you having to search for them. Money begins to flow through channels you never expected. But here's where patience and trust become your greatest allies. The universe operates on divine timing, not human impatience. Your job becomes beautifully simple. Maintain your new identity while allowing the perfect circumstances to unfold naturally. Rush nothing, force nothing, demand nothing. Simply be who you've declared yourself to be, consistently and authentically. Right? I trust divine timing. In the comments, if you can feel yourself releasing the need to control the how and when. As you settle into this state of patient trust, gratitude starts flowing from you in a completely different way. This isn't forced gratitude. This is the natural expression of someone who genuinely recognizes their inherent prosperity. Gratitude becomes as automatic as breathing, because you're simply expressing the natural overflow of a consciousness that knows its own abundance. The combination of natural gratitude and intelligent detachment creates the perfect conditions for miracles to become your normal experience. Right? I am open to infinite possibilities. In the comments, if you can feel yourself opening to the universe's unlimited creativity. The true test of this transformation lies in how this new identity expresses itself through the mundane details of your everyday existence. Every action you take begins to emanate from this new financial identity you've claimed. When you wake up in the morning, you rise as someone who is financially secure. When you pay your bills, interact with colleagues, or plan for the future. All of these activities flow from the consciousness of abundance rather than scarcity. You're not putting on an act. You simply are different. The decisions you make carry a different quality, because they come from wisdom rather than desperation. I am financially secure is no longer an aspiration. It has become your lived reality, the foundation from which you operate, the truth that shapes every moment of your experience. The transformation is complete at the level of consciousness and identity. Now your only task is to allow the external world to catch up and reflect this inner reality back to you. Right. The transformation is complete. In the comments if you can feel this shift from working toward financial security to simply being someone who is inherently financially secure. When you truly embody this level of conscious abundance, you discover that this same principle applies to every aspect of human experience. You realize that what Florence revealed wasn't just about financial abundance. It was about remembering the divine nature that creates abundance in all forms. If you've stayed with me through this entire journey, if you can feel something fundamental shifting inside you, then you're exactly who this message was meant to reach. The fact that you're here right now is no accident. I pour my heart into creating content like this because I know how transformative these ancient wisdom teachings can be. If this resonated with you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel. And if you made it all the way to this moment with me, drop a comment saying, "This message was meant for me." So I know you were here for this complete journey. If you felt that connection, a like on the video helps other people find this message when they're ready for it, too. There's a video right here that takes this understanding even deeper. Click and continue with me over there.